Dan, if you force that woman to have sexual intercourse with you, our investigation will clearly indicate that. So let me ask you, did you force her to have sex with you?
No, absolutely not.
Did you take the money from the man?
Hey, man, I've told you, I had nothing to do with this thing, okay?
So let me ask you, did you sell any drugs last Saturday night?
No, none at all.
Each of these three individuals have verbalized a denial, but the message they send is very different. The meaning of what someone says is going to be a combination of evaluating the verbal behavior and the nonverbal behavior. Communication experts tell us that nonverbal behavior is responsible for more than half of the communication between two people. Nonverbal behavior is also something that is typically involuntary. We don't think about it. And as a result, communication experts also tell us that nonverbal behavior is more reliable than the spoken word. Now, you have to remember, of course, that there is no single gesture or movement or observation or posture that means someone is lying. We have to look at the overall pattern, the preponderance of their behavior during the course of the interview. But nevertheless, if we evaluate the behavior in proper timing and consistency and in remembering the factors, then we can come to a reliable conclusion. Body posture, for example, is something that is constant during every interview and that we can readily evaluate. Most truthful people during an interview should typically be sitting frontally aligned and leaning forward during much of the interview. It shows their confidence and interest in the process and in convincing you and displaying their innocence. Notice how the suspect orients his body directly in line with the interviewers, as this suspect is doing. The truthful suspect's posture is typically upright, but not rigid in the chair. During important questions, the suspect may lean toward the interviewer. On the other hand, a deceptive suspect may orient his body away from the interviewer in a non-frontally aligned position. It's also much more typical for the deceptive suspect to assume a leaning posture, perhaps supporting her head on her hand, as this subject is doing. A third possible deceptive posture is the rigid posture. This is a very controlled posture, and in effect, the suspect is so preoccupied with his deception that he appears frozen in the chair and even unable to move. This particular suspect also has retracted feet, where he has tucked them in underneath the chair. The opposite position, where the feet are extended into the interviewer space, is usually associated with a challenging suspect, not uncommonly a juvenile. As investigators, we want to be observing the individual's posture throughout the entire course of the interview. One of the distinguishing features of posture is that for most truthful people, their posture is dynamic. In other words, during a 30 or 40-minute interview, their posture will change several different times. It's fluid, it's smooth, it's casual, but it changes. On the other hand, for many deceptive suspects, their posture is rather static and unchanged during the entire interview. These two examples will illustrate the general descriptions of the posture of a truthful person versus that of a deceptive. A truthful suspect's posture can generally be described as frontally aligned in the chair, comfortable and relaxed, and upright. They will usually lean forward. It's a sign of interest and participation, and it's dynamic throughout the interview process. On the other hand, a deceptive suspect's posture generally can be described as non-frontally aligned in the chair, rigid or frozen, sometimes even slouched or even collapsed, and generally static throughout the interview. Another nonverbal behavior we want to take a look at are barriers. Barriers are typically used by subjects to give themselves psychological protection from the interviewer, and as a result are much more associated with the person who's not telling the truth. The two most common barriers we see are folded arms and crossed legs. Now, the timing as to when these barriers occur is most important to evaluating their impact on truth or deception. For example, in the next two illustrations we're going to see, each subject moves into a barriered posture after they were asked the critical question.
Why do you think Bob said he saw you selling marijuana?
Hey, come on, how should I know? I mean, who knows why people say things? I sure don't.
Mark, have you ever thought about sexually touching a child?
No. Not seriously.
Another area of nonverbal behavior that we want to discuss includes grooming gestures, personal gestures, and protective gestures. All three of these are physical activities many deceptive people engage in to either disguise a delay before they answer or to relieve themselves of some of the anxiety that occurs when they lie. When we talk about protective gestures, we're talking about such activities as the person putting their elbow on the desk next to them perhaps, their chin in their hand, and sitting there like this for the next 15 or 20 minutes without moving. Totally inappropriate behavior for the interview. Or they may be the individual who hides their eyes when they answer a question by using their hand as a shield. Or the individual who tries to mask their answer by holding their hand over their mouth when they answer your question, almost hoping that you don't hear what they say. When we talk about grooming gestures and personal gestures, we're talking about such things as dusting the jacket, picking lint off of a sleeve, perhaps fixing the tie, perhaps stroking the back of the hair, stroking the chin in phony deliberation, trying to think of what to say. All of those activities in and of themselves don't mean a person's lying, but when you see them happen in conjunction with an answer to a key question, you should question the integrity of that response because it very well may have been something less than the truth. Let's take a look at a couple of illustrations that show us what these gestures look like during an interview.
Last Friday, were you with Fred at all?
I worked late that night. I didn't stop by his place at all.
Well, did you talk to Fred last Friday night?
I don't recall having any conversation with him.
This next case illustrates an individual who is using grooming gestures in an effort to relieve themselves of the anxiety that is associated with their lie.
Crystal, about the drugs that were found in your house that you say were left by friends, did you ever use any of these drugs?
No, I mean, I didn't even know they were there until the search.
You say you didn't use any of the drugs. Did you ever see the drugs?
No, I told you I didn't know they were there until they searched the house and found them.
Most truthful people do not use grooming, personal, or protective gestures when they answer key questions, but they do use their hands when they talk. And these hand movements are typically referred to as illustrators. Truthful people use their hands, use illustrators to emphasize a point, to express sincerity, or to recreate the physical activity that they're describing.
Mary, why don't you just tell me what happened last Friday night?
Well, he approached me from behind and pushed me to the ground. And he had something in his hand, a knife or a tool of some sort. And he told me if I screamed, he'd hurt me. And then after he finished having sex with me, he told me that not to tell anyone. And well, I was crying and I went home.
Because the use of illustrators is so common, even habitual, in most conversations, the deceptive person may just use token illustrators during an interview. These might just be hand or wrist movements instead of the whole gesture. The following is an example of token illustrators.
Mark, why do you think she's saying this about you?
I have no idea. Really, kids are just tough to figure out sometimes.
Mark, is she lying when she says you touched her vagina?
Yeah. I know she is.
The last area of nonverbal behavior that I want to discuss today is eye contact. How well does the person maintain eye contact when they answer key questions? First of all, we have to set the background. In a conversation between two people who really don't know each other, which is the case of most of our interviews with suspects, mutual gaze should be maintained about 30 to 60% of the time. It's not absent, but it's not totally constant either. Our focus is going to be on how does the person look when they answer the key questions. Each of us has our own level of eye contact that we typically maintain with another person. So we want to begin our interviews with non-threatening questions so that we can watch and establish the normal eye patterns of this individual person. So then, as the interview progresses, and as we get into the key questions, we can see, do they look us directly in the eye when they answer, or do they avoid our eyes by looking down or off to the side or perhaps up in some way? Most truthful people maintain direct eye contact. On the other hand, oftentimes the deceptive avoids our eyes or looks to the side when they answer. In the following example, we'll see an illustration of a typically deceptive person who avoids eye contact on the key questions.
Tom, what do you think should happen to someone that leaves the scene of an accident to where a pedestrian was hit?
I don't know. I'm not a judge.
Tom, do you think under any circumstances that someone should be given a second chance?
It would depend on the circumstances, what all was involved.
Tom, why wouldn't you do something like this?
You could get caught, thrown in jail. I wouldn't know. I wouldn't do anything like that.
I want to emphasize that there's no single behavior that automatically means a person is lying or telling the truth. In any given interview, a truthful person is bound to do or say something that could be interpreted as suggesting deception, and vice versa. We have to read the overall behavioral pattern displayed during the interview. And we also have to focus on reading what we call behavioral clusters. Not just single isolated gestures or statements, but the entire group of activities that occur when a person answers a question. The cluster of behavior that we see. Let's take a look at the following illustration to see what a behavioral cluster looks like and to try to evaluate everything simultaneously.
Mark, would you be willing to take a polygraph examination regarding the issue of whether or not you sexually touched this girl?
Polygraph? Yeah, sure. I guess I wouldn't object to that.
When they ask you whether or not you sexually touched this girl, what do you think the results of the test will show?
How should I know? I've never taken a polygraph test before. I don't know how they work.
How accurate is the interpretation of a subject's nonverbal behavior during an interview? Research suggests an 80 to 85% accuracy range. But when we make mistakes, they are usually in the false positive area, which means the interviewer makes the mistake of reporting a truthful person as though they were lying. As a result, we need to remember a few things when we do interviews. Number one, if the verbal and nonverbal behavior displayed by the subject during the interview is consistent with the person who's telling the truth, you can usually put a high degree of reliability, of confidence into that assessment. It's not foolproof, but it's usually pretty good. Secondly, we always have to remember that we need to give the subject a chance to prove their innocence during the interview. We can't go in there with a preconceived notion that they're lying and then just go through the motions. We've got to give them a chance. We've got to be fair. We learned in the prior program that verbal behavior is usually very controlled. We think before we speak. Well, in this program, we saw that nonverbal behavior oftentimes is very involuntary. It's spontaneous, and we don't think about it. As a result, to effectively and accurately interpret someone's truthfulness, we need to evaluate verbal and nonverbal behavior together in conjunction with each other. Physical activities of a deceptive person may be categorized into the following general types. Posture changes on key questions, such as sudden movements of the upper and lower body, or turning away from the interviewer. Grooming and personal gestures, such as cosmetic adjustments, rubbing the hands, stroking the back of the head, rearranging the jewelry, or picking lint from the clothing. Protective gestures, such as placing a hand over the mouth or eyes when speaking, crossing their arms or legs, or placing their hands under or between their legs during the interview. When a suspect consistently exhibits these nonverbal behaviors in conjunction with their verbal answer, there's a very strong probability the person has been deceptive and has lied to us during the interview. But behavior symptoms should never be viewed in a vacuum or in isolation. We always need to evaluate behavior in conjunction with our case evidence and our case facts. Only then can we make a proper and solid conclusion as to this person's possible involvement. Now, on the next tape, we're going to talk about the Reed 9 steps of interrogation and show you how we take a person from the stage of denial to the first admission of guilt, eventually to the complete confession.